Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was upon a raw November morning, when the fog lay pressed like damp felt against the panes of Baker Street, that I found Holmes disposed to an unusual indolence. His violin lay idle upon the chair, his chemical table wore the abandoned look of a camp after battle, and he sat with his long limbs curled upon the hearthrug, his eyes half closed, as if invited to truce by the sullen fire. London, that vast chest whose lid is seldom quite shut, had pulled itself close for warmth. The street sounds came muffled, hoofs dull upon the sodden roadway, a distant coster's cry broken by the mist, and now and again the small hiss of raindrops striking the coals. "You have been with the army again this week," Holmes observed without turning his head. "My boots betrayed me," said I, laughing, for his voice had the air of a man stating a commonplace. "Not your boots, though they are polished by a hand that has lately washed linen in cold water, which argues a servant of frugal habits and a cracked basin. No, your left cuff, which has the faintest discoloration of carbolic and oil, the mixture used by that young surgeon at the Marylebone dispensary whose hand you praised last Tuesday. Add to it the slight stiffness at your shoulder from holding a ledger on your knee in a jolting cab, and the matter is hardly a riddle." Before I could reply, her landlady's steps came bustling up the passage, and a moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman whose very entrance altered the temperature of the room. He was of middle height, spare and keen-featured, with the intense pallor that sometimes accompanies sleeplessness. His coat was excellent, and his linen irreproachable, but his hat, Holmes's gaze went to it as a pointer to game, was beaded with fine moisture and dusted by the faintest grey bloom, not of rain, but of ash. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said, bowing with a composure that did not conceal the tremor of his hands. "I beg your pardon for this intrusion. My name is Basil Fortescue. I am secretary of the Aerarium Club in Pall Mall. Holmes motioned him to the armchair nearest the fire and regarded him with that mingling of courtesy and penetration which I have seen quiet stronger men than our visitor. The Aerarium, if the reader is not acquainted with the geography of London's more exclusive haunts, is one of those sober, expensive establishments where diplomacy and tobacco have long made their pact. It prides itself on a library, a cellar, and above all a smoking room. "You have come from a room in which many men smoked," said Holmes, "and yet you yourself do not." Fortescue started. "I have not smoked these 5 years, Mr. Holmes. No. Your breath declares you abstemious. Your coat lacks the stale sweetness which clings to the habitual smoker. And yet your hair—" Holmes leaned forward, flicked a stray mote from the man's shoulder, and held it on the pad of his finger. "Your hair bears the fine deposit of Turkish tobacco, not the club's ordinary Havana fog. You have been breathing a denser atmosphere than Pall Mall commonly affords at this hour. It is that very atmosphere which has brought me here," Fortescue said, and drew from his breast pocket an envelope whose flap was unsealed and whose lower edge had been scorched to brown lacework. "I scarcely know how to lay the matter before you without seeming absurd. We have had a death at the club, a most lamentable occurrence, together with an appearance which I can only call, for want of better language, a writing in smoke." Holmes's eyes opened fully then. "Pray be exact in every particular," he murmured. The secretary swallowed and began, with the quiet diction of a man schooled in committees and minutes. "Last evening, the Right Honourable Lord Welland," Fortescue paused. "Welland, as you know, has lately been Under-Secretary at the Home Office, though he retired this summer. He has long been a member of our club. He dined modestly, read the evening papers in the library, and at 9:45 requested that the smoking room be left to him for half an hour. He said he had letters to write and disliked interruption. It is not unusual. Members sometimes desire privacy. The room was accordingly cleared. Our porter secured the door upon the outside with the spring catch, leaving the key in its ring on the corridor hook, as is our custom. No one entered during the interval. At 10:30, as the rules require, the porter opened the door to announce that the fires were to be banked and the lights lowered. Lord Welland was found seated in the great leather chair by the hearth. He did not stir. He was dead, natural causes. I ventured. That is what Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard is inclined to believe, said Fortescue. There was no mark of violence. His lordship's face was somewhat congested, the eyes slightly prominent. The room, however, Fortescue's composure wavered. Mr. Holmes, the room was thick with smoke, thicker than any I have known. And upon the oak panel above the mantelpiece there was, how shall I describe it? A sentence, as if written by an invisible hand which the smoke had made visible. We wiped the panel. The letters vanished. When the room again clouded, they returned. The words were these: "Return the letter." Holmes put his fingers together and regarded our visitor as a naturalist regards a rare moth. "You are sure, sir, that no corrosive or lampblack had been applied to the wood?" he asked. We examined it with Lestrade. There was, to the eye, nothing upon the surface. The words appeared only when the air was dense. When the porter opened the windows, the inscription faded like breath upon glass. And Lord Welland had been writing. There was stationery on the small table near him, Fortescue answered, but no written sheets, only a blotter, a pen laid crosswise and an envelope partly scorched, which I have brought. He offered it again. Holmes took it, sniffed delicately at the charred edge and turned it in his fingers. A curious perfume, rose attar adulterated with benzoin, and a trace of something less innocent, he murmured. "Pray continue. There is little more to tell." No one had seen Lord Welland receive or send any letter that evening. He arrived at 8. He left the library at 9:45. He died. Fortescue's voice dropped sometime within that half hour. Lestrade holds that apoplexy or the like seized him in the chair. A servant, he says, may have played some foolish trick with lampblack or walnut juice upon the panel at some earlier date. As for the message, it is an impertinence or coincidence, and you do not find that sufficient? Fortescue's hands tightened upon the hat in his lap. Mr. Holmes, the aerarium does not tremble at coincidence. But there is this. Yesterday morning the porter brought to me an envelope with no more address than the secretary. It contained a single torn scrap inscribed, "When the smoke rises, so shall the truth." I took it for a pleasantry and destroyed it. Now his glance flitted from Holmes to me and back again. Now I fear I destroyed a warning. Holmes rose with that sudden alacrity which always foretold action. "Your porter, old soldier, short of breath with a cough he denies and a fondness for shag, is a careless fellow in the small matters and a martinet in the large. I dare say his keys are hung like medals, and he glances at them oftener than is needful. He will swear the door was secure because he prides himself upon it. Very good, we shall test his pride. Watson, your coat. You will come at once." Fortescue's relief was so keen that it shaded into anxiety. The club committee is already uneasy. Lord Welland's name is not one we would have printed in conjunction with foolish spectacles. I confess I came to you before communicating to his family the peculiarity of the panel. Holmes took his hat and cane. "You did wisely," he said. "There are occasions when silence is innocence's only weapon. Tell me, Mr. Fortescue, Lord Welland was not a smoker of Turkish cigarettes?" "Never. He was a Havana man to the end. He had a particular affection for the Rio Seco brand, and yet your hair, sir, has just tasted the breath of a very fine Turkish leaf, of a sort popular in certain foreign cafes, and among a small class of Londoners who affect the Levant." Holmes's eyes had that distant brightness, which is not light so much as acceleration. "One more point. Who besides Lord Welland knew that he would have the room to himself?" "No one, to my knowledge. The request was made quietly to me, and I gave the order to the porter. Then the room did not stand empty before his lordship entered, for perhaps 2 minutes only, while the few remaining members drifted off. Mr. Chaffin, a barrister, Colonel Mowat, and Mr. Dacres of the bank were the last to leave. They can all be accounted for after 10. Holmes nodded as if adding pegs to a mental hat stand. "Return the letter," he repeated very softly, as though he addressed the oak panel itself. "There are letters one returns to their sender for courtesy, others for fear, and a few because to keep them is to court ruin. Come, Watson, Mr. Fortescue, we shall trouble your porter first, your panel second, and your cellar not at all, though I shall own a curiosity as to your Turkish supply." 5 minutes later, we were in a hansom, that nimble insect of our city, jolting toward Pall Mall through a fog that seemed to have acquired deliberate purpose. Holmes sat with his head bent, his long fingers beating a silent measure upon his knee. I knew better than to intrude upon his reverie. He was building, timber by timber, one of those airy structures of thought which I had seen resist the stoutest battering of facts. Once only he spoke, and then not to me. There are men, Watson, who write with ink and leave blotches, and there are men who, to save their skins, write with air and hope the world will not learn to read it. Our task this morning is to read smoke. If the reader supposes that the incidents which followed were anything but extraordinary, he underestimates both the ingenuity of wickedness and the curious laws that govern its exposure. For in that sober smoking room, with its leather chairs and courteous lamps, we were to encounter a contrivance which had been contrived to be invisible, and a message which demanded to be seen only when the lungs protested. And behind it all, though I did not yet guess it, lay a letter, the E, keeping of which would have unmade a man who fancied himself beyond the worlds. Reach we found the aerarium with its brass freshly rubbed, and the porter exactly as Holmes had foretold him, short, square, and decorated with keys as though he paraded campaign medals. He saluted Fortescue with an aggrieved precision and led us down a hushed corridor that smelt of old leather and faintly of damp wool. Holmes allowed his gaze to idle over trifles, the cut of the porter's heels, a fray on the bell-pull, a smear of soot above the transom, while Fortescue rehearsed in a lowered tone the club's miserable chronology. "Before we proceed," said Holmes, "I should like to see the hook on which your keys hang." The man rattled them dutifully and pointed at a polished board by the door. Holmes stooped as a fisherman might inspect curious weed. A single ring was scored, where a key had been replaced with a swifter hand than pride would admit, for the varnish about it was lightly abraded while its neighbours shone as calm as bishops. Holmes's cane tip touched the faint dust line below the hook. "You were punctual then," he murmured. "More punctual after the discovery than before." The porter coloured. I had the door open in a trice when it was time, sir." "Ah," said Holmes, and dismissed the matter with a nod that meant he had not dismissed it at all. The smoking room, when we entered, was that decent sanctuary in which a man may imagine he thinks better with a cigar. The chairs lounged in quiet companionship, Turkish rugs absorbed the light, and the great oak panel above the mantel regarded us with an air of seasoned discretion. The fire had been relit. Outside, the fog pressed its blank face against tall windows. Lestrade awaited us, a compact figure with an expression at once professional and a little sulky, like a terrier obliged to sit. "You are late to a plain business, Mr. Holmes," he said. "A gentleman takes ill and dies. The rest is fable." Holmes's bow was as thin as a drawn violin string, and the fable writes itself upon oak. "Will you oblige me by having those windows shut?" "No, quite closed, if you please." "Watson, lend a hand with the curtains." "Thank you. And you, Fortescue, allow no one to enter until I give the word." Lestrade sniffed. "You'll choke us for a fancy." "I shall teach the air to speak," Holmes returned, kneeling at the hearth. He examined the grate, the shovel, the coal scuttle, and from the fender lifted delicately, with a folded handkerchief, a spent match whose wood was stained a peculiar amber halfway to the head. He brought it to his nose. "Benzoin beyond question. Resin much beloved of those who prefer their smoke to carry secrets." "Benzoin?" I asked. "A gum which, when heated, yields a sweet odour, and a film to which soot will cling readily. Combine that with a fine, dry Turkish tobacco, and your vapour writes like a pen upon any surface prepared to receive it." The envelope we saw was singed by the same agent, a foolish toy to some, a language to others. He drew from his pocket a small spirit lamp, the familiar companion of his more recondite experiments, and set it alight within the grate, where the air would draw steadily. From another pocket he produced a paper twist, which he unrolled to reveal a pinch of brown flakes. "A sample I have carried since a case in Fitzroy Square," he said by way of apology, to Fortescue's widening eyes. He crumbled the leaf into the lamp's blue tongue and lowered the little iron grate. So at once a thin aromatic smoke began to curl upward, gentle as a cat. We waited while the room grew dim within itself, the air taking on a pearly density. Lestrade coughed loudly and then, with less bravado, again. Holmes had stationed himself beneath the panel, his eyes intent. It was I who first saw the letter forms detach themselves from the grain, as dew outlines a spider's web. The faintest outlines at first, then darkening by degrees until the words stood boldly upon the wood. "Return the letter," the inspector muttered an oath. Fortescue's breath caught. His gloved fingers whitened over the back of a chair. Holmes did not exclaim. He stepped close, held his lens a bare inch from the panel, and traced with the cane's ferrule not the letters themselves, but the margin where they dissolved into wood. Then, with the nail of his forefinger, he scraped delicately and brought back a dust finer than flour. He held it out to me. "Do you observe, Watson? Not soot alone, there is a sticky granularity like powdered rosin." "Prepared," I said. "Someone painted the words with a solution, and the smoke has found purchase." "Just so. The message then is no miracle, but a contrivance. The question becomes whose contrivance and when." He glanced toward the fire-iron stand. "A smear on the poker where it was warmed to hasten the drying, and this," he indicated a barely visible drip at the curve of an O, "tells us the hand was not practiced. The letters swell and thin. See how the second R falters? An amateur with instructions or a man of talent hurrying." Lestrade recovered his voice. "And if a trick, what of the death? I have the physician's opinion of apoplexy. Your physician notes a face suffused, eyes prominent." "He did not note." Holmes pointed to the wing-back chair in which we were told Lord Welland had sat, "the prickle of ash inside the collar where it rubs the nape. He did not note the faint blister along the inner rim of the cigar cutter." "Let me see the cutter, Mr. Fortescue." It was brought from a drawer in the sideboard. Holmes held it level and blew sharply. A flake lifted from the inside face of the ring, a crystal almost invisible. He touched it with his tongue and instantly spat into the grate. "Bitter almond, the ghost of it. It is as I feared. The crystals are from prussic acid vapor, condensed upon a cold metal. Not enough left to kill a flea now, but enough last night if introduced to the lips with haste and confidence." Lestrade stared. "You accuse a cutter. I accuse a human hand that prepared it, knowing his lordship's liking for a neat end to his Havana. Our man paints the panel to ensure an after-dinner melodrama, and he cedes the means beside the chair. Lord Welland trims his cigar, brings the implement close. A film of poison, vapor fast when warmed, steals over the cut tobacco and the lips that test the drawer. A swift hand, Lestrade. A private half-hour. A window that opens too late." Holmes set down the cutter as tenderly as if it had been a snake. Fortescue had sunk to a chair. "Good God, then it was murder." "Not yet in the newspapers," Holmes said dryly, "and therefore still ours to understand. Who knew of the half-hour?" "You, the porter, and the 3 members who quitted the room as he entered. Of those 3 which smelt of the Levant." Fortescue looked wretchedly uncertain. "Chaffin smokes pipes of the common sort. The colonel abhors cigarettes. Mr. Dacres I cannot recall." Holmes was already moving, his gaze returning to the transom. He mounted a chair and ran a finger along the ledge above the door, then down the hinge. "Our porter is a martinet in the large matters," he said softly, "and a sloven in the small. He prides himself on closing a door. He neglects to dust what cannot be seen. Note the narrow streak where dust is broken, recently and by a cord drawn smartly over the angle, a cord tied perhaps to a key-ring lifted for a moment from its hook." The porter bristled. "No one touches my keys." "Except a man who stood talking to you and at some jape or pretext." "What was it?" "Asked to see the very hook. You turned to boast of your punctuality and your method, and his hand did the rest. The key was out and back in a heartbeat, enough to take its impression in wax, enough to slip the door later when Lord Welland sat alone." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "And where did your magician stand?" Holmes pointed to the hearthrug. "Here. See the faint half-moon of ash where a heel turned inward, an Eastern habit to anchor the foot while one lights a thin cigarette from a coal. The ash is not Havana. It is too fine by far. He let the smoke thin, threw the curtains wide, and in the returned daylight the letters melted once more into honest oak. The room seemed to exhale. "Names, Mr. Fortescue," Holmes said. "Addresses. The last known habits of Mr. Dacres, Mr. Chaffin, and Colonel Mowat, and the list of servants with access to this room and the sideboard where the cutter is kept. I shall also require the club's register of guests for yesterday and the evening prior." Lestrade had recovered his terrier's set. "And what part of London do you hunt first, Mr. Holmes?" "The part where men who do not smoke pretend they do," Holmes answered. "A very small ring of cafes where Turkish leaf is cherished, and where benzoin is more than perfume. There I hope to find a gentleman whose hair breathed the Levant this morning, and who knew last night that a letter, some letter, was held over Lord Welland like a sword." He glanced once more at the panel, as if the wood might answer him. "Return the letter," he repeated. He could not return what he did not possess. "Therefore, Inspector, we must discover who placed that demand here, knowing it would be read only after a man was silent, and who contrived that he should not speak at all." Holmes left the club with the brisk step of a man who had already drawn a map in his mind, and now wished only to walk its streets. The fog had thickened until the lamps burned like yellow wicks inside woolen lanterns. We hailed a cab, and Holmes instructed the driver for Soho with a precision that suggested he had already fixed upon his hunting ground. I knew better than to pester him with questions, for his mood was taut as wire, yet there was no mistaking the current of thought that ran through him. His eyes half closed, lips barely moving, he repeated the words in a rhythm as though each syllable tapped at some hidden door. "Return the letter." It was near Wardour Street that Holmes dismissed the cab and led me on foot through a warren of narrow alleys where the fog grew fragrant with spices, lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of incense. At length, we came to a café whose sign, painted with minarets and moons, was almost invisible in the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with Turkish tobacco, rising in blue coils that lent the room a dreamlike quality. Men sat cross-legged upon low divans, sipping from long pipes, their eyes half-lidded but keen. Conversation murmured in accents not native to London, and the whole was conducted with the languid secrecy of a place accustomed to listening ears. Holmes did not enter as a stranger. With a flick of his wrist he produced a visiting card, passed it to the proprietor, and spoke in a tongue I did not know. The man bowed low and indicated a table in the corner. Holmes bent close as we seated ourselves. "Here, Watson, one finds every perfume and every vice the Levant can spare. Benzoin, opium, amber, and above all the Turkish leaf. Observe the clientele. They are no common sailors or labourers, clerks, minor officials, a scattering of students, and a few whose cut of coat bespeaks a richer table. Among them, if fortune favours us, our man." He had not long to wait. A thin fellow entered, carrying himself with that peculiar stiffness of one accustomed to restraining nerves by willpower. His moustache was neatly waxed, his hair oiled, and his gaze swept the room with a caution that was at odds with the setting. Holmes's eyes lit as though he had found a dropped coin. "There," he murmured, "Mr. Dacres of the bank. Note how his hair shines with the same grey ash I observed on Fortescue. He will take a seat, light his cigarette, and betray himself." As if on cue, the man drew a slim case from his pocket and produced a Turkish cigarette, lighting it with the practiced inward turn of heel Holmes had pointed out in the smoking room. He exhaled slowly, watching the curls drift before his face. Holmes rose and crossed the room with the air of a casual acquaintance. I saw him exchange a few words, bend close and laugh in that rare and disarming manner which seemed to disarm even the wary. Dacres looked surprised, then cautious, then faintly uneasy. Within minutes, Holmes had secured his leave to join him, and they returned together to our corner. "My friend Dr. Watson," Holmes said smoothly, "who knows more of apoplexy than I ever shall. We were just speaking of a mutual acquaintance, the lamented Lord Welland." At the name, Dacre's hand faltered, the cigarette burning an inch of wasted smoke before he remembered to draw. He recovered quickly, yet too quickly, and declared it a shock. "I was in the very room not half an hour before his lordship entered. A vigorous man, though elderly, yet the heart may betray at any time." Holmes inclined his head as though accepting the platitude. "Just so. And yet curious, is it not, that the panel chose to inscribe itself with a demand that a letter be returned? Such marvels London throws up." Dacres blinked. "A panel?" Holmes leaned in, his voice low and confiding. "Come, Mr. Dacres. You did not remain in that room without seeing what was done there. The panel spoke, though only to those who understand how smoke writes. Your hair still carries the echo of its message." For a moment the man seemed to shrink into himself, then stiffened. "I know nothing of panels. I left the room in company with Colonel Mowat. If there was writing, it is news to me." Holmes regarded him with that expression I have seen. Render the stoutest criminal speechless. The half-smile, the half-closed eyes, and the patient silence that compels a man to fill it. At last, Dacres muttered, "If there was a message, it was no affair of mine." Holmes's reply was velvet over steel. "And yet the letter it spoke of was an affair of yours, was it not? You knew Welland had been entrusted with papers that bore upon the bank's affairs. You knew also that those papers might unmake a reputation, perhaps a career. Return the letter. Ah, but it was not in his possession to return, was it? It was in yours." The cigarette trembled between Dacre's fingers. He ground it out with unnecessary force and rose abruptly. "You speak in riddles, sir, and I have no taste for them. Good evening." Holmes did not move to detain him. He watched the man depart into the fog with that curious look of satisfaction which was never the sign of a finished hunt, but of a trail scented afresh. Only when the door had closed did he speak. "He is our fox, Watson. He carries guilt in his very breath. Yet the crime is not wholly his. There is another hand, cooler, less clumsy, that prepared the panel and the cutter. Dacres may have lit the match, but someone else laid the fuse. Come, we must speak with Colonel Mowat and Mr. Chaffin before the yard blunders into daylight with too simple a story." We stepped once more into the fog, the lamps burning low and the city closing round us like a book not yet finished. Holmes set a course for Mayfair, where the Colonel resided, his step quick despite the mist. I followed in silence, knowing that the lines of the puzzle were tightening, and that somewhere between the smoke-written words and the bitter almond trace lay the shadow of a letter whose possession was worth a man's life. The cab carried us westward, the fog thinning as we passed into the wide streets of Mayfair, where lamps glimmered against polished railings and the clatter of hooves echoed more cleanly. Holmes leaned back with his arms folded, his eyes fixed, upon some point inward, the way a mathematician sees his problem written on air. At last he stirred and spoke half to himself. Dacres flinches like a guilty man, yet the hand behind the panel was steadier than his. "There is more than one actor here, Watson. A partnership, perhaps, though not of equals. I smell in it a guiding mind." When we arrived at the Colonel's residence, a solid townhouse fronted by columns and lit discreetly within, we were admitted without delay. Colonel Mowat was a man of imposing stature, his shoulders still square despite his years, his manner blunt to the point of curtness. He received us in a study lined with campaign maps and rifles mounted above the mantel, the scent of polish and pipe smoke lingering in the air. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "you are not the first to call today. That terrier from the yard has been worrying at my heels since morning. I tell you the same as I told him. I smoked my pipe, I finished my paper, and I left Welland to his peace. Whatever mischief befell him came after I was gone." Holmes inclined his head politely and lowered himself into a chair. "I do not doubt your word, Colonel. Yet mischief has a way of seeding itself earlier than the harvest. Tell me, did you observe anything in the room unusual before you left?" "Unusual?" The Colonel frowned. "Only that Dacres seemed restless. He lingered when the rest of us had gone, fussing with his cigarette case as though he had misplaced something. I told him it was bad form to delay a man who wished solitude. He muttered something I did not catch and followed at last. Beyond that, nothing." Holmes's fingers tapped lightly on the chair arm. "And you saw Welland later in the evening?" "I did not. I went directly home. By the time news reached me, he was already gone." The Colonel's expression softened a fraction. "I knew him many years. We served together in India. His death, however it came, is a loss." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then rose. "You have been most clear, Colonel. One final question. Did Lord Welland ever mention to you the matter of private papers, letters perhaps, that troubled him?" The Colonel's brows knit. "Never to me. He was close-mouthed, always. If there was such a burden, he bore it alone." We took our leave, and in the cab Holmes was silent until the lamps of Mayfair receded behind us. "A soldier, Watson, blunt and unvarnished. He has no hand in trickery. Yet note what he said. Dacres lingering, restless. A man uncertain whether his preparations had been discovered. The chain tightens. Our next call was upon Mr. Chaffin, the barrister, whose chambers lay near Lincoln's Inn. We found him in a dim office stacked with briefs and smelling of ink. He was a wiry man with a quick, bird-like manner, his fingers ink-stained, his gaze darting between Holmes and myself, as though measuring every syllable for cost. When informed of our errand, he laughed shortly. Lord Welland's death is a tragedy, yes, but if you think I had hand or knowledge in it, you are mistaken. I left that room no later than the Colonel. The club is no place for melodrama. Holmes's voice was gentle. And yet melodrama intruded. You saw nothing of the panel, nothing of the cutter upon the sideboard? Nothing whatever. My business was with a case file, and once finished, I excused myself. I left Dacres behind, yes, he seemed in no hurry to quit the smoke, but I noticed nothing amiss. Holmes's eyes did not waver. You are precise in your language, sir, as becomes your profession. Permit me one more inquiry. Did you ever observe correspondence between Lord Welland and the bank? Any mention, perhaps, of securities or guarantees? Chaffin stiffened. You ask questions that tread upon confidence. As a barrister, I cannot disclose— You disclose already, sir, Holmes interrupted, by your very defensiveness. I do not require particulars. I require only the confirmation that Welland's possession of certain letters was known to others besides yourself. That is enough. Chaffin colored but did not reply. Holmes thanked him gravely and drew me away. Outside he hailed a cab once more, his face alive with suppressed energy. We have 3 witnesses, Watson. One who lingers uneasily, one who observes that lingering, and one who knows more of letters than he dares admit. Now consider, who among them had the skill to paint a panel with resin, to seed a cutter with poison? Not the Colonel, whose hands are more used to sabres. Not the barrister, though he may know the value of words. It is the banker, Dacres, who moves between accounts and documents, who frequents a café where benzoin is known, who trembles at the mention of letters. And yet he is not alone. Someone guides him. The cab rattled us back toward Baker Street, the fog beginning to lift as dawn threatened faintly in the east. Holmes pressed his fingers together beneath his chin. There is an invisible partner here, Watson. Someone who desired Welland, silenced and used Dacres as instrument. The letter itself, we have not yet seen it, but its shadow lies everywhere. We must return to the club tomorrow at first light, when Lestrade is weary and less inclined to guard his theories. In the meantime, I have a small errand. He dismissed me at our door, yet himself strode away into the night with that peculiar tirelessness which overcame him at the scent of prey. When he returned hours later, his coat damp with fog and his eyes shining, he would not at first speak. Only when he had thrown himself upon the sofa and lit his pipe did he remark in a tone almost casual, "The bank has enemies, Watson. One of them has learned to write in smoke." He would say no more, and I was left with the unease that the letter in question was not a trifle of private indiscretion, but a document heavy enough to tilt the scales of men's fortunes, perhaps even of ministries. And in its shadow, Lord Welland had died. When Holmes emerged from his chamber the following morning, his expression bore that peculiar light which I had come to recognize as the herald of swift discovery. He had slept little, if at all, yet he carried himself with the vigor of a man whose mind had been sharpened by the night. Without preamble, he bade me take my hat, and together we walked briskly through the crisp air, the fog of the previous evening having thinned into a pale haze. The streets, washed clean by a light rain, gleamed under the weak sun. Holmes set a course once more for Pall Mall, where the aerarium stood grim and respectable, as though the secrets of the night had never been whispered within its oak-panelled rooms. Lestrade awaited us at the door with a look of sour triumph. "You have come too late, Mr. Holmes. I have my man." Dacres was taken at dawn. He denied much, but the evidence was plain enough. His debts at the bank, his strange haunts in Soho, his unease when questioned all point to one conclusion. He killed Welland to conceal some fraud, and the matter is ended. Holmes regarded him with a gaze so coldly amused that the inspector shifted in irritation. "Ended, you say? A case is not ended when the wrong man is in custody, Lestrade. Dacres is guilty of something, but not of murder by poison. If you will allow me the courtesy of 1 hour in the smoking room, I will prove it to you." Grumbling, Lestrade consented, and we were admitted once more to that sombre chamber. The panel above the mantelpiece stared back at us in honest silence, the fire laid fresh but not yet lit. Holmes knelt at the hearth with a deliberation that spoke of preparation rather than improvisation. From his pocket, he drew a small file and a scrap of cloth, moistening the wood along the skirting. A faint odor rose, Sweet, resinous, unmistakable even to my untrained senses. Benzoin again, Holmes murmured. It clings like a guilty conscience. Observe, Watson, the line of smears just below the letters. It was not Welland who touched this panel, but another hand, tall enough to reach without stretching. Dacre's is slight, scarcely taller than yourself. To paint so evenly, the brush must have moved from the shoulder of a man of greater height. Consider also the tremor in the strokes, not the unsteady nerves of Dacre's, but the haste of a stronger man, ill-suited to delicate work. Lestrade snorted. And who is this taller phantom, if not the banker? Holmes's eyes glinted. The colonel, of course, a soldier accustomed to bold movements, not fine lines. He admitted he left the room after Dacre's, yet Chaffin declared the opposite. The inconsistency betrays him. One of them lied, but only one had cause to. Colonel Mowat had history with Welland in India, and that history may conceal a debt of loyalty, or more dangerously of betrayal. I could not restrain my astonishment. But Holmes, the colonel, was frank, almost blunt in his manner. He seemed the least likely of all to practice subterfuge. Precisely, said Holmes. The mask of bluntness is his greatest protection. Yet the preparation of the cutter, which required access to the sideboard, must have been performed when the room lay briefly unattended. Who had both the opportunity and the authority to loiter there under no suspicion? Not Dacre's, whose unease was plain. Not Chaffin, who was eager to depart. But a colonel, respected, familiar with the club, could linger by the sideboard while others took no notice. It is he who laid the poison, Watson, though he may have left the writing to another's instruction. At that moment Fortescue entered with a face pale from sleeplessness. In his hand he bore a sealed envelope. Mr. Holmes, he said, this was discovered this morning in the letter-box of the club. It is addressed to me, but within— He broke the seal and withdrew a single sheet. Upon it were scrawled the words, "The truth lies buried with Welland. Pursue it no further." Holmes examined the sheet closely, sniffed it and held it to the light. Written in haste with common ink, but folded while the paper was yet damp. It bears no watermark, yet the fibres tell me it is from the very stock the club provides its members. Our author feared discovery within these walls, yet dared not write elsewhere. That narrows the field. He turned suddenly upon Fortescue. Sir, when you spoke yesterday of the warning you destroyed, the scrap that said "when the smoke rises," did you destroy it entire or keep some portion? Fortescue flushed. I confess I tore it, but a corner remained in my drawer. I thought it too small to matter. Bring it to me at once, Holmes commanded. The secretary obeyed, returning with the fragment. Holmes compared the fibres of the two papers, his lens gliding over the edges. As I suspected. The same batch. And note the hand. See how the descender of the G drags heavily, just as in this morning's note. The same writer, Watson. The same man who placed the message in smoke upon the panel. Lestrade, though visibly reluctant, leaned forward. Then who, Mr. Holmes, if not Dacre's? Holmes smiled thinly. Patience, Inspector. The net must close only when all its knots are tied. For now we must contrive a test. This evening, when the members gather again, we shall require their company in the smoking room. I will ask each to write a line for some trivial purpose. The hand will reveal itself, and with it the murderer. Until then, keep your prisoner, but watch him narrowly. He may yet betray an accomplice. As we left the club, I observed Holmes's gait quicken, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. You see, Watson, he said, a letter once written may be burned, but its shadow persists. It clings to ash, to resin, to the guilty hand that sought to efface it. Welland held such a letter, one that spoke of deeds in India long thought buried. Mowat feared its return, and Dacre's poor fool was drawn in as tool or pawn. But the true web is larger, and before the night ends, I shall have its master in my grasp. I could not repress a shiver, for the air about us seemed suddenly chill though the sun had risen, and I knew that beneath the calm surface of London there stirred a secret capable of killing one man and frightening others into silence. And as Holmes led me back toward Baker Street, I felt with every step that the letter hidden in smoke had begun to write its story upon all of us, line by line, until the final revelation would stand as stark as words upon oak. That afternoon passed in restless anticipation. Holmes paced the sitting room like a caged hound, pausing only to scrawl brief notes or consult volumes of reference, with an air of suppressed impatience. He had dispatched a boy from the irregulars with instructions I was not permitted to hear, and when the fellow returned near dusk, Holmes pocketed the scrap of paper he brought without a word. At last, as the lamps were being lit in the streets, he rose abruptly, thrust his arms into his greatcoat, and announced that the hour had come. The aerarium greeted us with its usual hush, though I fancied a nervous undercurrent in the movements of its members. Fortescue met us in the vestibule, his composure frayed. "The committee acceded to your request, Mr. Holmes. The gentlemen are gathered in the smoking room. They are uneasy, but they agreed, though Colonel Mowat grumbled mightily." "Excellent," Holmes replied, his tone as crisp as the evening air. "Let us not keep them waiting." The scene within was singular. Around the broad table sat the three figures upon whom suspicion had hovered. Mowat grim and defiant, Chaffin cool and watchful, Dacres pale and twitching. Lestrade, stationed by the mantel with two constables discreetly at his back, looked as though he would rather be anywhere else, but was determined to see the play through. Holmes advanced to the table with easy authority. "Gentlemen," he said, "this inquiry has been plagued by shadows and whispers. Tonight we shall have light. I ask only that each of you in turn write a brief line upon this sheet, nothing more than the words, 'Return the letter.' A trifling exercise, but it will suffice." He produced fresh paper and a pen, laying them upon the table. The colonel gave a snort but seized the pen first, scrawling the phrase in bold strokes and flinging it down with the air of a man insulted by the request. Chaffin followed, his hand rapid and precise, the letters neat as a clerk's. Dacres was last. His hand shook visibly as he wrote, producing an unsteady line, the ink blotting where he pressed too hard. Holmes gathered the slips, spread them beside the earlier note, and bent over them with his lens. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint crackle of the fire. At length he straightened, holding one slip between finger and thumb. "Here it is," he said softly. "The hand that threatened Welland before his death. The downstroke of the T, the drag of the G, it is identical. Gentlemen, the writer is Mr. Chaffin." A stir ran through the room. Chaffin's thin lips tightened, but he met Holmes's gaze steadily. "Preposterous," he said, "a mere resemblance. Anyone might form letters in a similar fashion." "Not so," Holmes retorted. "I have examined thousands of specimens. Your hand betrays you. Moreover, you alone had knowledge of the letter's legal weight, for you were engaged in matters touching the bank. You knew what Welland possessed, and you feared its disclosure. To silence him, you contrived this grotesque display, using Mowat's presence as cover and Dacres as tool. You painted the panel, you drafted the threats, and you arranged the poisoned cutter. The others were pawns. You were the strategist." Chaffin's composure cracked. His fingers twitched at the arms of his chair, and a film of sweat gleamed on his brow. Mowat surged to his feet in outrage. "Do you accuse us all? I had no part in such devilry." "Indeed," Holmes replied smoothly, "you had none save that your blunt honesty concealed the confusion of times that Chaffin required. You were misled, Colonel, as was Dacres here. The true mastermind sits before us still." Lestrade stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "Do you deny it, Mr. Chaffin?" The barrister's voice was sharp as a whip. "I deny nothing. Yes, I wrote the words. But I did not lay poison in that cutter. I am no assassin. I wished only to frighten Welland, to compel him to return the cursed document before it was too late. Someone else took my warning further than I ever intended." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Ah, at last the truth begins to edge forth. Then who held the cutter, who poisoned it? You spoke of too late for whom?" Chaffin's eyes darted toward Dacres. The banker flinched as though struck. "It was not I," he cried. "He pressed me. Yes, he pressed me to recover the letter. I feared exposure of accounts, disgrace, ruin. But I never touched that infernal instrument. I swear it." The room seemed to tremble with the weight of their voices. Holmes raised his hand for silence. "Enough. You, Chaffin, wrote the threats. You, Dacres, provided motive. But the act itself, the cold placement of poison upon steel, that was done by one who possessed both access and authority, a man who could linger at the sideboard without suspicion. That man is Colonel Mowat." The colonel's face darkened like thunder. "You dare—" "I dare because the evidence compels me," Holmes said with icy calm. "The smear of resin bore the stroke of a tall arm. The cutter was handled by one who knew the weight of weapons. And you, Colonel, had the most to lose if Welland returned that letter. In India, years ago, certain dealings passed between you, dealings recorded by Welland in a private document. Its emergence would not merely wound you, it would destroy you. You silenced him in the only way you knew. A dreadful silence followed. Mowat's jaw clenched, and for an instant I thought he would spring upon Holmes. But his shoulders sagged at last, and he sank back into his chair. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. He would have ruined me. After all these years, after service and honor, he would have dragged it into the light. I could not allow it. Lestrade motioned to his men, who stepped forward to secure him. Chaffin covered his face with his hands, while Dacre slumped as though the burden of dread had been lifted, only to be replaced by shame. Holmes stood serene, amid the turmoil, his eyes cold, his manner almost detached. "So ends the play," he said. "A letter, a panel, a poisoned cutter, each a piece of a design to preserve reputations built upon sand. Lord Welland would not return the letter because he no longer had it. You three knew that fact, yet each feared the others might accuse. It is the common fate of conspirators. Distrust breeds violence, and violence betrays itself." As Lestrade led the Colonel away, Holmes turned to me with a weariness that only I could see beneath his mask. "Come, Watson, there is little more for us here. The letter itself may yet be unearthed, but its shadow has already claimed one life and shattered 3 more. I fancy it will never trouble the light again." We stepped out into the night, the fog stirring once more along the pavement. Holmes drew his coat close and lit a cigarette. His words drifted through the smoke like an epitaph. "Men think they may burn paper, Watson, and be free, but paper burns slowly when it carries truth. In the end, the smoke writes their story for them, and the world learns to read it." The cab rattled us back toward Baker Street in heavy silence, the wheels striking sparks on the wet stones, where gaslight pooled in wavering circles. Holmes sat hunched in his corner, the glow of his cigarette a solitary ember, his thoughts locked far beyond my reach. I had seen him in triumph often enough, but tonight there was no air of victory about him. When at last he spoke, it was as though his voice had travelled from a great distance. "Justice, Watson, is a brittle word. Mowat's hand placed the poison, yes, but not from the black impulse of a cutthroat. He acted from the desperation of a soldier who feared dishonor more than death. Chaffin penned his threats to coerce, not to kill. Dacre's was a pawn in the shadow of ruin. And yet, Welland lies cold, and the truth has not been spoken in full. We have revealed the culprits, but not the cause." I reminded him that the Colonel's confession was plain enough. The Indian years, the secrets buried there, it was motive in abundance. But Holmes shook his head. "A confession wrung from collapse is not always truth, Watson. It is surrender." He admitted what was plainest, but I suspect more. "You recall the notes, both the fragment and the morning's warning? They were written not merely to silence Welland, but to misdirect. Someone wished to steer suspicion toward one man, then another, to keep us chasing shadows, while the true prize slipped away." "And the prize," I said quietly, "is the letter itself." "Precisely. Welland died because of it. But where is it now? It was not found upon him, nor in the smoking room, nor among his papers. If Mowat killed to prevent its return, then he too did not possess it. Someone else does, and that someone remains at liberty." His words settled upon me with a chill heavier than the fog. For all that the Yard congratulated itself on securing its prisoner, the case was not yet done. The next morning brought a damp greyness over London, the city yawning back to its labours, as though no death had stained the night before. Over breakfast, Holmes unfolded the Times and read silently, then thrust the sheet aside with a sound of disgust. "They trumpet the arrest as though it were the crown jewel of detection. The world is content with a simple villain. But we are not of the world, Watson. We must go deeper." He spent the morning in restless energy, dispatching telegrams, consulting ledgers, and rifling through the chemical cabinet with muttered calculations. By noon he had donned his coat again. "Come," he said, "we must call on Lady Welland. If anyone can tell us what became of that letter, it is she." The widow received us in her drawing-room, a delicate figure swathed in black, her face pale but her eyes steady. Holmes's manner with her was grave and courteous. He spoke not of murder at first, but of her husband's habits, his concerns of late, his correspondence. She answered with composure, though her voice trembled at times. "He was troubled, Mr. Holmes. For weeks I saw it. He spoke little, but at night he would pace or sit long at his desk staring at papers. Once I asked him what burden he carried. He replied only, 'The past will not stay buried.' I thought he meant his health, perhaps politics. I did not know it was so grave." Holmes leaned forward gently. "Did he ever show you a letter or speak of one that endangered him?" Her hands twisted in her lap. "Only once. He said he had received a communication from abroad, India, I think, reminding him of an incident long ago. He burned it at once, yet afterwards he kept searching among his papers, as if another were missing. He feared some document had been taken from him. 2 nights before he died, he told me, 'If I do not recover it, others will suffer.' I pressed him, but he would say no more." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Taken from him, not retained by him, as Mowat believed. That alters the landscape entirely. Thank you, madam. You have given me more than you know." As we stepped back into the damp air, Holmes's stride quickened. "Now we see the truth, Watson. The letter was already gone before Welland's death. He was not slain to keep it in his possession, but to prevent him from declaring its theft. Chaffin's threats, Mowat's terror, Dacre's complicity, these were but the eddies around a current they did not command. Someone else cleverer, more silent, has the letter still." "And who, Holmes?" I asked. He gave me a sidelong glance. "Do you not perceive? The one man we have trusted most. The man who brought us into the affair, who guided our steps, who alone had constant access to Welland's papers before his death. Basil Fortescue, the secretary. The name struck me like a blow. Fortescue? But he seemed the picture of duty and anxiety. It was he who summoned you. Exactly. The surest disguise is to present oneself as helper. Fortescue admitted he destroyed the warning note, but kept a fragment. Why keep a fragment unless to control the evidence? He produced the scorched envelope at the start, as if by chance, but he had opportunity to place it. He was first to see Welland's body, first to speak of the smoke letters. Who but he could manage the scene so carefully before summoning Lestrade? He plays the quiet steward, but he directs the entire stage. I was too astonished to reply, but Holmes's reasoning rolled on like an iron engine. "We must move quickly. Fortescue holds the letter, and with it a weapon against the bank and perhaps against the government itself. If he suspects our suspicion, he may flee or destroy it. Tonight, Watson, we set a snare. We shall invite him to Baker Street on a pretext of aiding our report. While he believes himself secure, I will press him where his mask is weakest, and when the moment comes, the letter will emerge from its hiding place." That night, as the lamps burned low and the street outside grew quiet, Holmes prepared the sitting room with meticulous care. Papers were strewn across the table, as though in disarray. A decanter of brandy stood half empty by the fire. I saw the familiar gleam in his eye, the thrill of the hunter closing on his quarry. "Watson," he said softly, "you will observe closely but speak little. Fortescue will betray himself by a gesture, a word, a glance. The letter is our quarry, and before this night ends it shall be in my hand." I felt a weight in the air as if the very walls held their breath. Somewhere beyond the fog-draped windows, footsteps approached. The knock came, measured, polite, inevitable. Holmes straightened, every line of him tense with anticipation. "Now," he whispered, "let the smoke at last clear." Holmes himself opened the door, his expression one of courteous gravity, and Basil Fortescue stepped into the lamplight. The secretary looked pale, his eyes shadowed by fatigue, yet his manner retained its professional polish. He removed his gloves carefully, laid them upon the side table, and bowed to us both. "So you requested my presence, Mr. Holmes. If there is aught I may supply for your report, you shall have it." Holmes indicated the armchair opposite the fire, his tone genial but edged with purpose. "Pray be seated, sir. There are matters yet obscure, and your knowledge of the club's inner working may dispel them. A brandy, perhaps? You look in want of one." Fortescue accepted with a faint smile, though his hand trembled as he lifted the glass. He sipped, then sat upright, composed once more. "The Yard is content with Colonel Mowat's arrest. I assume, however, that you are not." Holmes's eyes flickered with something like amusement. Your assumption is correct. The Colonel's guilt is real but incomplete. He placed poison, yes, but under the guidance of another mind. That guiding hand remains at large. Fortescue's brow furrowed, but his voice was steady. Then I trust you will reveal this unseen villain. The committee, I assure you, would wish the matter laid to rest without further scandal. Holmes leaned back, pipe between his fingers, and let the silence stretch until it seemed the room itself grew tense. Then he spoke, low and deliberate. The unseen villain, Mr. Fortescue, is none other than yourself. The secretary's eyes widened, though only for an instant. He set the glass down without haste. A bold charge, Mr. Holmes. Upon what foundation? Holmes tapped ash into the tray. Upon many. You were first upon the scene, and so contrived its arrangement before the porter admitted Lestrade. You produced the scorched envelope with suspicious readiness. You admitted destroying the warning note, but curiously retained a fragment, as if to control the evidence. Your hair, sir, bore ash of Turkish tobacco, though you profess not to smoke. And above all, you alone had unbroken access to Welland's papers in the club. If the letter vanished, it passed through your hands. The man's mask held for a heartbeat longer, then cracked. A faint flush spread across his cheeks. His lips pressed into a thin line. You are relentless, Mr. Holmes. Yet even should I possess this letter, what proof have you that I stole it? Motive, perhaps, but not evidence. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Motive alone would not suffice. But the writing betrays you. The threats to Welland, the notes you claimed as warnings, they bear the same peculiarity of hand as the club records you keep. I took the liberty of consulting the ledger this afternoon. The downstroke of your G, the crooked bend of your T, they are identical. You may disguise much, Mr. Fortescue, but not the unconscious habits of a pen. Fortescue's composure faltered, his breath quickening. If what you say is true, he whispered, then the matter is beyond retrieval. The letter cannot be produced. Holmes's tone was suddenly sharp as a whip. On the contrary, it shall be. You did not burn it, for its power lies in its existence, not its destruction. You secreted it elsewhere, in some place you believed safe. Bring it forth now, or I shall summon Lestrade, and let the Yard unearth it with far less courtesy. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Fortescue's hands clenched and unclenched upon his knees. At last, with a shuddering breath, he rose. Very well. You leave me no choice. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, drew forth a flat packet bound in twine, and laid it upon the table. The twine quivered in his hands. There, he said hoarsely. The letter. Welland received it years ago in India, and kept it hidden. It names names, details transactions, bribes, thefts of state funds meant for the garrisons. Mowat was implicated, yes, but not he alone. The letter touches others in high office still. Had it become public, it would have shaken the government. I could not allow that ruin. Holmes untied the packet with delicate precision and scanned the contents swiftly. His eyes gleamed with a cold light. Remarkable. A document indeed capable of unmaking more than one reputation. And so you became its custodian, judge, and jailer. You orchestrated threats to frighten Welland, then guided Mowat's hand to silence him. Your intent was not only concealment, but power. With this letter you could compel obedience, shape decisions, wield influence beyond your station. Is that not so? Fortescue's silence was answer enough. His chest heaved, and for the first time his polished exterior collapsed. I sought to protect the nation, he said at last. But the words rang hollow. Holmes placed the letter upon the table with deliberate care. You sought to protect yourself, sir. Welland resisted you, and for that he lies in his grave. You cannot escape this truth. The secretary's face crumpled, and he sank back into the chair as though the strength had left him. His eyes closed, his lips moving soundlessly. I felt a pang of pity. Yet Holmes remained cold, his gaze fixed and unyielding. After a long pause, he rose and rang the bell. Watson, fetch Lestrade. Our guest has something to deliver into official hands. When Lestrade entered moments later, his surprise was almost comical. Holmes passed him the packet with a bow. The true prize, Inspector. Guard it well, for it will tempt many to silence it again. Lestrade's expression shifted from disbelief to grudging admiration. By heaven, Holmes, you never fail to pluck the devil from the shadows. I'll see this lodged where no hand can reach without the law. Fortescue made no resistance as the constables stepped forward. He rose only once, his eyes lingering on Holmes with a strange mixture of awe and bitterness. "You see everything, Mr. Holmes," he murmured. "But there are some truths best left unread. Remember that when the day comes." Then he bowed his head and allowed himself to be led away. When the door had closed and silence returned, Holmes stood by the fire, his features carved in thought. The flames painted his face with restless light. Strange, Watson. One man killed by poison, another ruined by confession, a third unmasked by his own ambition, all for a letter. Words on paper, yet they wielded more power than any blade. Men imagine they command documents, but in truth documents command them. I ventured that justice at least had prevailed. Holmes gave a half-smile, weary and distant. Perhaps. Yet I wonder if the greater crime lies not in murder, but in the silence that follows. Fortescue was right in one sense. These words will rattle high places. Whether the nation is better for their revelation remains to be seen. But our part is finished. He sank into his chair, filled his pipe, and drew the smoke slowly, eyes lost in the fire's depths. And though the night beyond Baker Street was thick with fog, I could not shake the image that lingered with me, words writing themselves upon air, refusing to vanish as if truth itself, once loosed, would always find a way to be read. The hours after Fortescue's arrest passed in a strange quiet. Baker Street felt heavier than usual, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of the revelations. I busied myself with my notes, attempting to order the events into some coherent narrative, yet I found my thoughts unsettled. The faces of Mowat, Chaffin, Dacres, and now Fortescue jostled against one another like fragments of a broken glass, each reflecting a shard of guilt. Holmes sat opposite me, pipe in hand, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind no doubt retracing every step. At length he spoke, his voice low, almost reluctant. "You perceive, Watson, that though we have secured the letter and delivered the guilty, there remains a thread unresolved." I looked up, startled. "Unresolved? But surely the case is complete. Fortescue confessed in all but words, and the evidence is irrefutable." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Confession of possession, yes. Confession of murder, no. Consider, Watson. Fortescue guided events, but his hands never touched the cutter. Mowat poisoned, Chaffin threatened, Dacres concealed. But Fortescue remained behind the veil. His genius lay in manipulation, in setting one man against another. Yet the true fate of the letter before it reached his pocket, this we have not uncovered. He claimed Welland had already lost it. If that is true, then who first stole it? And why does Fortescue's account of its origins feel too rehearsed, too convenient? I admitted I had not thought so deeply. To me, the matter seemed ended with the secretary's downfall. Holmes rose suddenly, pacing with sharp strides, his fingers steepled before him. "No, Watson, something in Fortescue's bearing troubles me. He produced the letter with too little resistance, as though prepared for the demand. Men who clutch power rarely yield it so easily. It suggests to me that what we received is but one piece of the whole. Perhaps even a copy, not the original. The possibility chilled me. A copy? But then the true letter may yet remain hidden in hands we have not glimpsed. If so, Welland's death was but the prelude, and the play has not concluded. The question becomes, who stands to gain if the shadow of this letter continues to fall over London? He stopped pacing and fixed me with eyes alight. We must examine Welland's circle beyond the club. His correspondence, his visitors in the final week, the servants who handled his papers. There may be one more name in this ledger of guilt, and it is that name which holds the key. The following day we set about the task with relentless energy. Holmes visited the Home Office under some pretext, while I pursued inquiries at the club, speaking discreetly with servants and clerks. From them I gleaned that in the days before his death, Welland had received an unusual visitor, a man described as tall, foreign-looking, with a scar along his jaw. He had asked for Welland by name, waited with him in the library for half an hour, and left without signing the register. The porter, when pressed, admitted the man carried a faint odor of incense and tobacco. I reported this to Holmes upon his return that evening. His face sharpened with recognition. A scarred foreigner smelling of incense. "Watson, we are back in the cafes of Soho. Such a figure is not unknown to me. His name is Arif Bey, once attached to the Ottoman consulate, later a shadowy agent in various intrigues across Europe, a man who trades in secrets as others trade in coin. If he came to Welland, then the letter was already moving beyond English hands. Fortescue may have intercepted it, but perhaps not before Arif made his own copy. The idea of such a paper in the hands of a foreign agent filled me with unease. Then London is still in peril, Holmes. What are we to do? Holmes smiled thinly. What we always do, Watson. We follow the smoke until we find the fire. Tomorrow night we return to Wardour Street. If Arif Bey still haunts those cafes, I shall flush him from his den. You, my dear fellow, will keep your revolver close at hand. The following evening was thick with mist once more, as though London conspired to cloak the deeds enacted in its heart. We moved silently through narrow alleys until the lanterns of the Levantine Café came into view. Inside, the air was close with perfume and smoke, the same haze we had breathed before. Holmes's eyes swept the room, keen as a hawk's. At a table near the rear, half shrouded in shadow, sat a tall man whose scarred jaw caught the lamplight as he turned his head. His long fingers played with a cigarette, and his gaze rested nowhere yet seemed to see everything. Holmes approached with unhurried confidence, greeting him in fluent Turkish. The man looked up sharply, then smiled thinly. Their exchange was brief, low and filled with words I could not follow, but I saw the tension beneath the surface, the wary dance of two minds testing each other. At last Arif Bey produced a folded paper from within his coat, tapped it lightly upon the table, and returned it to his pocket. Holmes's expression did not change, but I knew at once he had seen what he sought. He returned to me, his step light, his eyes gleaming. It is as I suspected. He holds a copy. Fortescue gave us the semblance, but this man carries the blade itself. The game is not ended, Watson. It has only widened. We must contrive a way to recover that paper before it vanishes across the channel. I asked if he had a plan. Holmes's reply was quiet but edged with steel. A plan, yes, but it will require patience, disguise, and the willingness to play upon Arif's vanity. For men who trade in secrets cannot resist displaying them, if only to prove their worth. We must give him the stage, and when he flourishes his treasure, we shall pluck it from his hand. As we stepped back into the fog, the night seemed charged with unseen currents. I felt the thrill of the chase rise in me again, tempered by the knowledge that the stakes had grown beyond a single death or a ruined reputation. Somewhere in the folds of London smoke, a foreign agent carried a paper that could shake governments, and beside me walked the one man in all England who might wrest it back. Holmes's voice cut through the silence, calm and certain. We are close, Watson. The letter has not yet finished writing its story. Holmes was silent as we made our way back through the alleys, his long stride swift, his eyes fixed upon the mist ahead as though he could already see the shape of the next move. I knew that look. It meant his mind had already spun the web in which he hoped to entangle our quarry. Yet for all his composure, I sensed the tension in him. The letter was no longer merely an English scandal, but a weapon in foreign hands. And the thought of its flight across the channel lent an urgency that pressed like a weight upon us both. At Baker Street, he paced the sitting room with restless energy, his fingers drumming on the mantelpiece. Arif Bey will not part with the paper willingly. He lives by such weapons, and one does not surrender his livelihood to a polite request. To seize it by force would be folly. He would rather destroy it than yield. No, Watson, we must contrive a stage upon which he will be compelled to display it. Once it is in the open, I can strike. I asked him how such a thing might be done. He turned sharply, his eyes bright. Vanity, Watson. These traffickers in secrets are like conjurers. They cannot resist an audience. Arif Bey wishes to impress men of influence with what he holds, to prove his value and demand his price. We must learn when and where he intends to make such a demonstration. Once revealed, the letter will be ours to intercept. The next day, Holmes donned a disguise so complete that even I, though long accustomed to his transformations, started when he emerged. He had become a shabby Levantine trader, his beard straggling, his clothes reeking faintly of spice and smoke. With this guise, he vanished into Soho's labyrinth, leaving me to wait with growing unease. It was near midnight when he returned, weary but triumphant. Tomorrow night, he said, throwing himself into his chair, Arif Bey will attend a gathering in Bloomsbury, a discreet salon of political sympathizers, dilettantes, and men who fancy themselves movers of hidden levers. He will show them the letter to establish his authority. We must be there. I confess my heart quickened at the prospect, though I knew the danger it carried. Holmes prepared with meticulous care, arranging with Lestrade for quiet assistance should matters turn violent. He instructed me to carry my revolver, though he hoped it would not be needed. "Our aim is not blood but paper," he said. "Remember that." The following evening found us in a narrow Bloomsbury townhouse whose curtained windows glowed faintly. Disguised once more, Holmes as a foreign trader, I as his taciturn companion, we were admitted to a dimly lit room where a dozen men lounged upon divans, the air heavy with smoke and the murmur of speculation. At the centre sat Arif Bey, his scar catching the lamplight, his manner assured. Holmes moved with subtlety, placing us among the listeners, his eyes never leaving the scarred man. Arif spoke of governments, of secrets bartered like coin, his voice smooth and commanding. Then, with a flourish, he drew from his coat a folded packet. A hush fell. He laid it upon the table, resting his hand upon it as though upon a sword. "Here," he said, "lies proof of corruption in the highest offices of England. With this, one may unmake ministers, topple allies, and turn the game of Europe. Who will bid for such power?" A murmur swept the room. Men leaned forward, eyes gleaming with greed or fear. Holmes's hand brushed my sleeve, our signal that the moment had come. He rose with the air of a cautious bidder, speaking in the man's own tongue. The exchange was rapid, too swift for me to follow, but I saw Arif's smile widen, his vanity inflamed. He opened the packet, spreading its contents upon the table for all to see. That instant Holmes struck. With a deft motion he leaned forward, his hand passing over the papers as though to examine them, and in the same movement he palmed the key sheet, the one bearing Welland's name, the one that carried the true sting. He slipped it within his sleeve and continued the charade, speaking smoothly as if still bargaining. Arif, intoxicated by his own display, noticed nothing. Only when the meeting broke and we slipped into the night did Holmes quicken his pace, his hand pressing the hidden sheet. "We have it, Watson," he whispered, his voice taut with triumph. "The original." Fortescue's copy was but a shadow. This is the blade itself. We made for Baker Street at once, the fog curling round us like a cloak. Once safe within our rooms, Holmes spread the letter upon the table. It was as damning as he had foretold. Detailed accounts of embezzled funds, names of officers complicit, signatures enough to blacken reputations at the highest level. I read with mounting astonishment, scarcely believing that such treachery had been committed under the banner of empire. Holmes regarded it with cold satisfaction. Now at last the chain is complete. Welland died because he would not be silent. Fortescue sought to control, Mowat to conceal, Chaffin to threaten, Dacres to survive. But Arif Bey sought to profit, and through his vanity we have snatched the paper back. Tomorrow it goes to the Home Office, where it may be judged and secured. I asked him if exposure of such a document might not shake the nation to its core. He gave a weary smile. "It may. But better the tremor of truth than the silence of corruption. The law will decide how much may be revealed, but at least the letter will no longer be a weapon in the hands of the unscrupulous." The fire burned low as we sat in silence, the letter lying between us like some malignant relic. At length Holmes spoke again, his tone softer, touched with melancholy. "Strange, is it not, Watson? Words written in smoke, then on paper, then hidden, copied, stolen, displayed. A chain of deceptions, yet all leading back to one truth, that men cannot escape their past. They may burn the page, but the ash will cling, and the smoke will write their guilt upon the air." I could not reply, for I felt the weight of all we had seen. The death of Lord Welland, the ruin of Mowat, the disgrace of Fortescue, the corruption unveiled. Holmes reached for his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and let a low, mournful note fill the room. It hung there, trembling, like the last wisp of smoke dissolving into the night. And so the case of the letter, hidden in smoke, drew to its end, not with triumph, but with a somber recognition that justice, when won, is seldom free of sorrow. For even as the letter was locked away, I knew the memory of it would haunt us, as smoke haunts the air long after the fire is gone. The next morning dawned clear, the fog burned away by a pale sun, as though London itself wished to wash its hands of the shadows that had lingered over it. Holmes and I walked to Whitehall in silence, the precious letter secured in his inner pocket. At the Home Office we were met with grave faces. The document was received without flourish, sealed at once within the custody of men who understood too well the peril it carried. Holmes spoke little, answered their questions with economy, and declined any offer of official recognition. When we stepped back onto the bustling street, He drew a long breath of the cold air, as though glad to be rid of a burden that was never his to carry. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I reflected aloud on the ruin the letter had wrought. Welland dead, Mowat disgraced, Fortescue undone, Dacres exposed, Chaffin discredited. "It seems, Holmes," I said, "that one sheet of paper destroyed more men than any bullet could." Holmes gave a short nod. "And yet the paper itself was but the mirror, Watson. It showed men what they feared in themselves, and each acted accordingly. Welland would not bend, so he was silenced. Mowat feared exposure, so he turned to violence. Fortescue saw in it a ladder to power, and thus fell. Dacres clung to survival, Chaffin to influence. Each was undone not by the letter, but by his own reflection within it." We reached Baker Street, and Holmes, after laying aside his coat, collapsed into his armchair with an air of finality. He stretched his long legs toward the fire and clasped his hands together. His expression, though grave, bore the faint gleam of satisfaction that comes only when a puzzle lies fully assembled before him. "Shall you see, Watson, how each thread led us onward? The smoke upon the panel, the poisoned cutter, the frightened banker, the overbold barrister, the desperate soldier, the too helpful secretary. All of them pointed toward a truth that refused to stay hidden, as smoke refuses to lie still. And in the end the letter wrote its tale twice, once in fear, and once in justice. I asked him if he regretted delivering the letter to men who might, for reasons of state, lock it away and suppress its contents. His answer was calm, almost weary. "Our task is not to decide what truths the world can bear, Watson. It is to uncover them. The rest is in the hands of those whose duty is to govern. I have no doubt they will bury the letter deeper than Fortescue ever dreamed. But the difference is this: it will no longer be a weapon in the hands of those who play at power in smoke-filled rooms. For now that must suffice." The fire crackled softly. Holmes reached for his violin and drew the bow across the strings, the low notes filling the sitting room with a sound both mournful and strangely consoling. I sat with my notebook open but unused, content for once to let the silence stretch. Outside, the city moved on, heedless of the secrets that had nearly unmade it. At last Holmes lowered the instrument and spoke again, his eyes distant, his voice quiet. "There will always be letters hidden in smoke, Watson. Truths men would rather destroy than confess. Our task is only to read them before the air clears. For once cleared, the world pretends it never breathed them at all." And with that reflection he rose, turned to the window and looked out upon London. His silhouette stood sharp against the light, the great city sprawling beyond, already weaving its next tangle of lies and revelations. I knew then, as I have always known, that Sherlock Holmes would never be idle long. The smoke of one case had lifted, but somewhere another was already beginning to write its message upon the air, waiting only for him to read it.